Well, hello, and welcome to another edition of Word Concerning Prayer from the Pastor. We want to continue our series on cave prayer today. You'll recall that we have been looking at the 142nd Psalm, which was David's prayer while he was in the cave fleeing for his life from Solomon and his army. And what we want to do today is consider the 142nd Psalm in relation to the persecuted believer. As Christians, we will on occasion find ourselves in the cave of persecution. You recall in John chapter 15 that Jesus said that the world had hated him, and that if the world hated him, the world would hate us, and the world had persecuted him, and that the world would persecute us. Because we are called out of the world, because we are chosen by God, and remember here that David was God's anointed, the world will hate us. Sometimes those who are posers, that is, false professors in the church, will hate and persecute us, and they will say all manner of evil against us falsely. They do so because they are of the world. And this psalm is highly instructive for us when we are in the cave of persecution. David says in verse 3, he says, "My spirit faints within me." Persecutors can be slanderous and vindictive, and we may often feel overwhelmed by their unwarranted viciousness. But then David says, "Lord, you know my way." Though we may not know what to do when we're persecuted, God knows exactly what's going on, and we can trust Him to direct our path while we are in the cave of persecution. Then David says of his persecutors, listen to this in verse 3, he said, "They have hidden a trap for me in the path where I walk." Those who persecute us will sometimes wickedly devise schemes to try and make us appear guilty when we are not. Further, we may feel abandoned. Look at what David says in verse 4. He says, "There is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul." Indeed, we may find ourselves persecuted and discover that even those who should love us might abandon us when we are harassed by adversaries. We should follow David's example. He cries out, "I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." God will never abandon us when we're persecuted. It's also common to feel not only abandoned, but to feel utterly weak and helpless when we're persecuted. Notice David's words. He says in verse 6, he says, "My persecutors are too strong for me." To whom does David cry in his weakness? He cries in verse 6, "Lord, deliver me from my persecutors." When we are weak, we cry to God who is strong. We hide ourselves in the tower of God's strength, for He is immeasurably stronger than our adversaries, and He will soon put our persecutors to shame. May God bless you. Thank you for listening. Have a good week.